Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Steve Hawkins, and I'm with the Ignatian Volunteer Corps of the Twin Cities. We're a community of retired women and men who put our lifetime of experience, skills, and wisdom to work helping nonprofits in our area meet their mission in service to those in need. We are grateful for your support. I'd like to express our gratitude also to St. Thomas More, its pastor, Father R.J. Fichtinger, and the entire staff who have helped make this evening possible. And to our sponsors this evening, the Ignatian Spirituality Center of St. Thomas More and Marco House Jesuit Communities. We will be forever indebted to you. And a very special welcome to our brothers and sisters from the Annunciation community. Please know that you remain in our thoughts and in our prayers. You know, it seems that the Twin Cities has faced more than its fair share of tragedy in the last 5 years, beginning with the death of George Floyd and proceeding through August 27th at Annunciation. During that same period of time, it seems that the fabric of our community, of our entire society, has unraveled as well. We've become divided. It's we against them, right against wrong. I'm good and you're bad. I belong and you don't. Where do we go from here? Greg Boyle grew up in the 50s and 60s in California. In the early 70s, he entered the Society of Jesus and was ordained in 1984. Father Boyle's first assignment was at Dolores Mission on the east side of Los Angeles, probably one of, if not the poorest parish in Los Angeles. In addition, the parish was also home to an overwhelming number of gangs and gang members. Over the last 40 years, Father Greg has buried hundreds of young men and women, victims of that gang violence. But during the same period of time, he has, along with his organization, Homeboy Industries, helped thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of young men and women find a different path. Where there no longer are rivalries, individuals live together, work together, play together, and pray together. Father Greg was inducted into the California Hall of Fame. In 2017, he received the University of Notre Dame's Laetare Medal, and last year in 2024 was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He is the best-selling author of many books, including Tattoos on the Heart, Barking to the Choir, and most recently, Cherished Belongings, the healing power of love in divided times. When society is more fractured than ever before, Father Greg invites us to see the world through new lenses of connection and build a loving community that each of us longs to live in. Please help me welcome Father Greg Boyle.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to hold it close. Thank you, Steve. Thanks for mentioning that Presidential Medal of Freedom, because when I got it, a homeboy texted me and said, "Hey, I heard you got some presidential pardon or something." Yeah, something like that. Thank you, Bishop Kevin, and thank you, RJ, and my Jesuit brothers here. And I want to add my voice as well to so grateful to see Matt and Rose here and my friends from Annunciation. Thank you for being here tonight. Way in Los Angeles, of course, and other places in this country, we stand with you. So it's been the privilege of my life for 40 years to have walked with gang members, and the day won't ever come when I have more courage or I am more noble or I'm closer to God than the thousands and thousands of men and women who've walked through Homeboy in all these years. People like Hector, who was 15 years old, a gang member. He was an elementary school dropout. Sold drugs and violent, and he stopped and he started to work at Homeboy, and he started to inhabit his truth and his goodness. And he was sitting in front of my desk, and he was trying his hand at small talk, and he said, "Oh, by the way, I ran into a man who attended one of your talks once." I said, "Really?" He goes, "Yes. He found your talk rather monotonous." I said, "Oh my gosh, he did?" He goes, "Well, no, actually that didn't happen, but I need practice using bigger words." So I asked him kindly to practice on somebody else. Well, I've been in this church before, and it's a great community, and moments like this and an evening like this reminds you of what Martin Luther King used to say about church. It's not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And you go from here tonight, eventually, to nurture into being a community of kinship such that God might recognize it. You go from here and you imagine a circle of compassion, and then you imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And indeed, you'll go from here to decide to dismantle the barriers that exclude, because that's who you are. And you want to take seriously what Jesus took seriously. And you go from here and you stand at the margins, because that's the only way they will ever get erased, is if we stand out at them. And you stand with a particularity. You stand with the poor and the voiceless and the powerless. And you get to stand with those whose dignity has been denied and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. Every once in a while, you get this exquisite privilege to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. You will get to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And you will go from here, and you already know, especially those involved in the Ignatian Volunteer Corps, that you're going to have to brace yourself for people who will accuse you of wasting your time at the margins. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." You'll go from here, and other voices will get heard because of you. And I think that describes what the Ignatian Volunteer Corps is all about. Of course, none of that makes any damn sense at all if it's not anchored in a sense of God that's spacious and expansive, in the God who loves us without measure and without regret. We've settled for a partial God, and it's gotten us into trouble. Meister Eckhart, a theologian and a mystic, used to say, "It is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you." And we're all raised in such a way that we only believe that in a partial way, because we've created God in our own image, and that gets us in trouble. My friend Anne Lamott says, you know you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do. So we want to avoid that. And, so you want to go for the spacious, because otherwise our God becomes too puny and the container is too small. And Ignatius of Loyola talks about the God who's always greater. Just when you think you've landed on the best way to describe this notion of God, it's even greater than that. I remember many years ago I had a spiritual director who said, we need a better God than the one we have. He was a Jesuit, but of course he was right, because we've settled and we don't want to. Richard Rohr says that it's true enough that we are created in the image and likeness of God, but it's also true that our image of God creates us. And so we want to break out of that as best we can. Mirabai Starr, who's a mystic and a translator of mystics, and I recommend her books, she says, once you know the God of love, you fire all the other gods, which greatly describes what the whole maturing process in spirituality is really about. It's about firing all the other gods. Many years ago, for 40 years, I've been saying Mass in detention facilities, on a rotating basis. And we have lots of detention facilities, juvenile halls, jails, probation camps. And I was celebrating Mass in San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and it had about 200 gang members in the room. And I was up on a raised platform, and I had my alb on and my stole. And then there was the ambo over here, and the homies would come up and they'd do the readings. And they had this sheet that had the readings in English and in Spanish so you could follow along. And I had the sheet resting on my lap, and I thought, well, I'm going to close my eyes and hear the word proclaimed. And the first guy got up and read from the Hebrew Bible, and the second guy got up to do the responsorial psalm, and I don't know, there was an overabundance of confidence in his voice, and he gets up and he says, "The Lord is exhausted." And I looked at the sheet, I said, what the hell? And it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because the exalted God is, the God of our own projection. Because if we were God, we would want to be exalted. But the exhausted God, you can connect to it. I mean, I see enough white hairs in this room right now that, somebody might see you on a Monday, and how was your weekend? Oh, my God, I'm pooped. I had the grandkids the whole weekend, But it's a good tired. You know how people say that. But it's about generosity and giving of yourself, and it's other-centered, and it's loving-centered, and the exhausted God is pretty good, I think. One of the great inventions of COVID was Zoom, and I have 5 sisters and 2 brothers, and once a month now, ever since COVID, we go on Zoom. And the last time we were on, it was my mom's birthday, and she would have been 100 years old. She died at 92. My father had died 30 years before. And she died the way everybody wants to die, in your own bed, in your own home, surrounded by your kids and your grandchildren. And she was sharp as a tack, even to the very end. In fact, in the last year of her life, she watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And she wasn't a lick afraid of dying. In fact, a month before she died, she was just giddy. She was just exhilarated. And she said, "I've never done this before," which is something you would say just before skydiving. And in fact, the day before she died, I was sitting at the foot of her bed, and I was all alone in her room, which never, ever happened. You always had a bunch of people in there, but it was just the 2 of us. She was asleep. And she opened her eyes, and she saw me sitting there, and she said, "Oh, for crying out loud." And she went back to sleep. She was pissed she hadn't died. Sorry. And then the next day, I was sitting there again at the foot of her bed. This time it was exactly noon. Again, very odd. Nobody else was there. A couple of my sisters went out to get lunch or something. And at exactly noon, she opens her eyes and she lifts her head from the pillow. And she lets out this wondrous, glorious gasp. Skydiving. And she left us. And no one in earshot of that sound could ever be afraid of death again. And I remember in the last weeks of her life, she'd be in and out of consciousness, and there'd be 3 of her kids, 5 of her kids, all 8 of her kids, a whole bunch of grandkids. And she'd be in and out, and then when she came to, she'd lock onto just one. And she would look at this one person with laser beam focus, and with breathless delight, she'd say, "You're here. You're here." And I remembered that when we buried her, I thought, I think that may be the singular agenda item of our exhausted God, is to look at you with breathless delight and say, "You're here. You're here." In fact, we have this notion of Jesus 40 days and 40 nights in the desert. We have this notion of this. And, of course, that's the precursor for our Lent. And I can't ever mention the word Lent without telling you about a homegirl named Michelle Nunez, a tough cookie, grew up in the projects. And she came into my office one day, and she goes, "Well, it's official. I just found out my man's been cheating on me." I said, "Oh, my gosh, I'm sorry to hear that." "Oh, I don't sweat it. I just went to church, got me them ashes, gave his ass up for Lent." That has nothing to do with what I'm trying to talk about here, but I'm like Pavlov's dog. If I say the word Lent, I'm going to have to tell you about Michelle. But I digress. And so there's Jesus, 40 days, 40 nights. We have this notion, dark night of the soul, agony, grumbling stomach, doubt, when I suspect all it was God looking at this guy and saying with breathless delight, "You're here. You're here." And so we receive the tender glance, and then we choose to be the tender glance in the world. We notice the notice of God, and then we choose to be that notice in the world. We choose to stand at the margins, and we want to be in the world who God is: compassionate, loving, kind. I have a homie who I call him my spiritual director. His name is Sergio, and we email each other every morning, and we have for many, many, many years. I was a gang member. He worked at Homeboy. Now he runs a food pantry in Pomona. And every morning we read the readings for the day, and then we email whoever gets up first, and we're both up in the 3 to 4 range, and we email kind of just brief reflections, stuff that stood out from the readings. And just a couple weeks ago, he had ended an email to me, and he said, "So today I will surrender into the arms of God, then choose to be those arms." That's the entire law and the prophets. It just doesn't get better than that or clearer. You receive the tender glance in order that you can be that tender glance in the world. And that's the hope. So as Steve mentioned, Homeboy was started a long time ago. During the time I was pastor of a very poor parish, nestled in the middle of 2 public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village. At the time, it comprised the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other, which is unheard of in public housing, to have that many. LAPD called my parish the place of the highest concentration of gang activity in the whole city. So if LA was the gang capital of the world, my parish was the gang capital of Los Angeles. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988. And 3 months ago, I buried my 263rd young person. Not all from that parish, of course, but I know a lot of gang members. I get asked to do this. So the first thing we did was we started a school because there were so many middle school, junior high age gang members who had gotten the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. And so they were wreaking havoc in the projects in the middle of the day, and they were writing on the walls, they were selling drugs, they were violent. So I walked out to them, and I'd isolate them one at a time, and I'd say, "Hey, if I found a school that would take you, would you go?" And to my surprise, each one said, "Yes, I would." And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so I kind of forced my hand. So across the street from the church is our elementary school, Dolores Mission Parochial School. And grades K to 8 occupied the first 2 floors of this concrete 3-story building. The entire 3rd floor was the convent where the sisters lived. And so one night I gathered the nuns in the living room. There were about 8 of them. And I sat them down and I said, "Hey, would you guys mind, moving out? And we could turn the convent into a school for gang members." And they looked at each other and they said, "Sure." That was the entirety of their discernment process. And so we were off and running, and many gang members came from all 8 gangs, which meant 3 times a day we'd have big, huge knockdown brawls. I'd have to run across the street to calm it down. But they came. They came to school. This whole thing created a kind of a disconnect in the parish because parishioners would sidle up to me and they'd say, aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed? Good people in and bad people out. And so that was a good gospel challenge. But it was a tough place. The teachers didn't last long. I had a principal who lasted exactly 1 day. I called him the next morning to find out where the hell he was, and he had changed his phone number. And apparently he had checked into a witness protection program. But they came. And they started to say if only we had jobs. So myself and the women in the parish, and the profile in the projects are women and children. There weren't a lot of men. So myself and the women, we marched around the factories surrounding the projects, trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that wasn't so forthcoming. So we just had to start stuff, a maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a crew to build our child care center, all made up of members of the rival 8 gangs in the projects. Then on the last day of April in 1992, after the acquittal of the 4 police officers who beat down Rodney King, every pocket of poverty in Los Angeles erupted, except the poorest pocket, my parish. And so the LA Times wanted to know why that was, because we were kind of the most likely to erupt. And I said, well, I'm not entirely sure, but part of it was, I think, the fact that we have 60 strategically hired rival enemy gang members who have a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before. And more to the point of your question, a reason not to torch their own community. So the next day the article appeared. Well, the following day I was summoned to the Beverly Hills office of a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million. And he opened by saying, how should I spend my money? And I can see now that I woefully undershot my request. I was young, I had hair. I said, well, there's an abandoned bakery across the street from our school. You could buy it. It has ovens. They don't work, but you could fix them. And we could put hairnets on rival gang members, and they could bake bread, and we could call it Homeboy Bakery. And he said, sure. And so we were off and running again, and then a month later we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. Once we had plural, a bakery and a tortilla factory, we changed our name from Jobs for a Future to Homeboy Industries. And now 10,000 gang members walk through our doors every single year wanting to reimagine their lives. Every single one comes barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace, and the only thing that can scale that wall is tenderness. Every single one comes with what psychologists would call a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightened or frightening. And you can't calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. Each one walks through our doors and they hope to be safe and they want to be seen so that they can be cherished. Each one walks through the door and they're greeted by gang members just like them. Greeted by people whose whole being seems to say, you're here, you're here. You receive the tender glance and they hope to be that tender glance. If it's true that the traumatized are likely to cause trauma, then it has to be equally true that the cherished will be able to find their way to the joy there is in cherishing themselves and others. There was a homie I knew named Danny, and in the old days, I would ride my big old black beach cruiser through the projects, and I would patrol all 8 gangs, sometimes several times a night, sort of take their temperature. And I would see this kid, Danny. He was like 13 years old. Every time I rolled up on my bike, he was with the older homies, and he always made a point to lift his shirt to show that he had a gun tucked into the front of his pants. I don't know why he wanted me to know this. And he made a solemn vow once. He said, "I will never step foot in Homeboy Industries." I go, So I only knew him from the streets, and I knew him from juvenile hall, and I knew him from probation camp. And finally, at 18, he goes to prison just for 2 years. And gang recovery, like drugs and alcohol recovery, they say it takes what it takes. For gang members, it's the birth of a son, the death of a friend, a long stretch in prison. For Danny, he got out after 2 years, 20 years old now, and to discover that his mother had 6 months to live. She had pancreatic cancer. And Danny had a lot of siblings, but somehow he ended up being the hospice caregiver. And I would go over to his house, and I'd watched him with his mom, and he was so tender, which was all the more remarkable because she had been torturous towards him. And I anointed her once, and then like a week later, she died. A week after that, I buried her. And a week after that, Danny walks into Homeboy Industries for the first time. And I watch him inhabit the truth of who he is, that he is exactly what God had in mind when God made him. I watch him, as the homies say, laugh from the stomach. And I watch him get his GED and work side by side with guys I know he used to shoot at, because I remember. One day he comes into my office and he sits down and he begins very dramatically. "What happened to me yesterday has never happened to me in my life." And he proceeds to tell me after work at 5, he goes across the street to the Chinatown stop, the train, and he takes the train going east to go home. And he says the train is packed, but he manages to get a seat. And standing right in front of him, holding onto a pole, he says, is a medio pedo guy, a guy who's a little bit drunk. He's a gang member, he says. He's an older vato. I don't know who he is. He has tattoos on his hand. And Danny's wearing a sweatshirt that says, "Homeboy Industries, jobs, not jails." And the little bit drunk guy looks at Danny in the sweatshirt. He goes, "You work there." And Danny doesn't know whether he should fully engage this guy, so he just nods. And the guy says, "Is it any good?" And Danny shrugs and he says, "Well, it's helped me. In fact, I don't think I'm going to go back to prison because of this place." And then Danny stands and he carefully removes a piece of paper from his pocket and a pen, and he starts to write the address of Homeboy Industries. And as he's telling me this story, he says, "I couldn't believe I knew the address by heart." And he finishes it, and he looks at the guy and he sees him. And he hands the paper to him and he says, "You come see us. We'll help you." And the guy sees Danny and he says, "Thank you." And the train stops, the guy gets off. Now Danny, in the telling of the story, returns to that dramatic refrain. What happened to me next has never happened to me in my life. Everyone on the train was staring at me. Everyone on the train was nodding at me. Everyone on the train was smiling at me. And now he can barely speak. And for the first time in my life, I felt admired. And that is God's dream come true. That is the only reason we receive the tender glance, so that we can become the tender glance, and so that we together can nod and smile on a train as a community of kinship, where we obliterate once and for all the illusion that we are separate, where we come to determine definitively that there is no us and them, there's just us. Just us. At Homeboy, we're allergic to holding the bar up and asking folks to measure up, because our exhausted God never does this with us. Instead, we hold the mirror up and we tell people the truth, that they're exactly what God had in mind when God made them. And then you watch them become that truth. You watch them inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's huge. But you have to reach in and you have to dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. Parentheses, I'm a Jesuit, but the homies don't know what a Jesuit is. So there are 2 other, almost always 3 Jesuits who work there, and including novices and such. And but they don't really know what a Jesuit is. And so I'm in my office, and it's glass enclosed, so I can look out onto the whole floor, the reception area, and I can see who comes through the front doors. And we have about 8 tour groups a day from all over the world. People come to see Homeboy at our huge headquarters, where there's a bakery and cafe and a tattoo removal clinic, and we have 14 social enterprises, including dog grooming, which we just added, called Puppy Fades. And so we get a lot of tour groups. And so I'm in my office and talking to 2 homies right in front of my desk. And a big, huge group of 20 just plant themselves in front of my office. And it's one of those observe our founder in his natural habitat kinds of moments. And I wave faintly. And the tour guide is Osvaldo, who, as the homies would say, has a loud-ass voice. And Osvaldo goes, "This is Father Greg Boyle. He is the founder of Homeboy Industries. He is a jiu-jitsu priest." So from my desk, I do some of my more impressive moves. So I told you that to tell you this, that apparently on February 28th, 1540, St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, enters this one word in his spiritual journal or diary. He proceeds to use the word quite a bit for the remainder of his 12 years of life. Before he dies, he goes back and he circles the word for as many times as he used it. And I know Spanish, but I didn't know this word, and the word is acatamiento. Acatamiento. And it comes from kind of an archaic word, acatar, which means to look at something with attention. And it gets translated as affectionate awe. And though it was born of this singular relationship between the God who loves us without measure and without regret and Ignatius, I'd like to think that he wanted it to be broader than that, more spacious like the God we have. That in fact, as you reflect on going from this church outward, that you might ask yourself, what stance ought we to have at the margins? What is our disposition? And I want to suggest acatamiento, affectionate awe. And it reminds me in the Acts of the Apostles where it has this one line that says, and awe came upon everyone. And it suggests that the measure of health in any community at all, including this one, may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So many years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia. And it was what we used to call in those days a gang in-service. And so they would get 600 social workers together, and they'd commandeer a hotel ballroom, and they'd sign in and get credits. And there'd be keynotes and breakout sessions and workshops to kind of teach social workers, why do kids join gangs? And what might we do to help them? And so it addresses the lethal absence of hope which undergirds all gang violence. That violence, gang violence, is a lethal absence of hope. And so how do we address the fact that no hopeful kid has ever joined a gang, ever? And so how do you infuse hope to kids for whom hope is foreign? And how do you help heal the wounded? And how do you deliver mental health services in a timely and culturally appropriate way? So I'd done a lot of these. I said yes. I figured I'd do a keynote, and I bought my ticket to Richmond, Virginia. A week before I was to fly, I pulled out the letter that invited me, and to my horror, I discovered that I was to be the only speaker all damn day from 9 to 5. And also, as the homies would say, I said to myself, oh, hell no, I'm not going to be the only speaker. So I call in 2 trainees. So we have an 18-month training program. We have 500 trainees. We have 300 other staff. And so I invited 2 homies who were like in their 9th month of their 18 months with us. Andre, African-American gang member, and Jose, his enemy. And I sit the 2 of them down, and I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time. Because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I had never heard their stories before, and so Jose gets up first. He's like 25 years old at the time, and shot caller from his gang, and tattooed, and spent a long stretch in prison. At his 9th month, people are assigned to different places every other month, you know, and to the tattoo removal clinic, to the legal department, to the wellness team, to the curriculum department. And so Jose was working with the substance use disorder team. So he was a man solid in his own recovery, and now he's helping younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues. So not only was he shot caller, felon, prisoner, he also had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. And so Jose gets up in front of 600 social workers, and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. And 600 social workers audibly gasp. And then he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish. And we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. And then he continued, I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California. And she walks me up to an orphanage, and she knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door, and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine, and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 T-shirts to school each day. First T-shirt because the blood would seep through, and second T-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third T-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 T-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 T-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. Acatamiento, affectionate awe. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. And so this church is not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And you go from here to cling to the marrow of the gospel. And you go from here to take seriously what Jesus took seriously. 4 things: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. Let me just end with one last story, and then you will actually get to go from this place. It sometimes occurs to universities, mainly jiu-jitsu ones, to force their students to read my books against their will, and I'm not complaining. But my alma mater, Gonzaga University in Spokane, who ruins my bracket every March, forced the incoming freshmen to read Tattoos on the Heart. And so they said, could you come and could you bring 2 homies? And and I do when people ask. And I always pick homies in kind of the same way. I always pick rivals, pick enemies, just to force them to share a hotel room, just to mess with them, you know. And and I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of watching gang members panicked in the sky. I was at LAX, 2 older vatos, and one of them says to me, hey, gee, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I said, yes, it's a requirement. We'll be coming home on American. So I picked two homies, Larry, an African-American gang member, and Mario. And I've been on a lot of trips lately. I was just in Boston with two homies in Philadelphia. I've been a lot of places. And so I'm used to nervous Nellies. Oh, my God, this guy Mario. I was not prepared for how panicked he was. It was starting to freak me out. He was hyperventilating, which I'd never witnessed in a human being before. I can't do it with my voice. And we hadn't even, boarded the plane yet. But so we flew out of Burbank Airport, which is small-ish, but big Southwest Airlines planes. And you don't walk through that hermetically shielded chute. You walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president, and you climb up the steps to go to the front of the plane. Big feature at Burbank, steps to go up to the back of the plane. And I'm sitting there with Mario, and Larry is off walking, exploring the airport. It's early morning. It's still kind of dark. It's the first flight of the day. And I see our flight attendants arrive, and two female flight attendants were holding very large, each of them 2 cups, very large cups of Starbucks coffee. And they're schlepping up the steps to board the plane. Just then, Mario says, "When are we going to board the plane?" And I said, "As soon as they sober up the pilots." There they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that, but I should tell you that Mario, in our 37-year history as an organization, is the most heavily tattooed person who works there, which is really saying something. He's all sleeved out, all to his fingertips with tattoos. Neck blackened with the name of his gang. Head shaved, covered with tattoos. Forehead, cheeks, chin. Eyelids that say "the end," so that apparently when he's lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt for anybody. And I'd never been in public with him, and so I was walking him through the airport, and I was just amazed. People are going, "Oh, my God," and mothers are clutching their kids more closely, and I'm going, wow, if you were to go to Homeboy tomorrow and walk up to anybody there and say, "Quick, who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here?" They would wait one beat. Every single one would say, "Mario." Yeah, Mario. Mario is proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. Mario is proof that tenderness is the highest form of spiritual maturity. So we get to Gonzaga, and there's the Tuesday night big arena, 1,000 people. But they don't tell you that during the course of the whole morning, they'd like you to visit 93 classrooms and talk to them. And so I tell these guys, you get up and tell your stories. I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom. And they did. They got up. And Mario was really nervous, but they did a good job. Stories of terror and torture and violence and abuse of every imaginable kind. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So we get to the big arena. I coaxed the two of them up to do what they had just done in 93 classes earlier. And it was a lot of people, so Mario was nervous, but they did a good job. And then I got up and did my thing, and then I invited them to stand on either side of me for a brief Q&A time. And yes, ma'am. And a woman stands, and she goes, "Yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario." First question out the gate. And Mario is a tall, skinny drink of water, and he steps up to the microphone, he clutches it, and he's just terrified. And he says, "Yes." And she says, "Well, Mario, you say you're a father and you have a son and a teenage son and daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them?" And Mario closes his eyes. He clutches the microphone with even greater intensity. He's getting a friggin' hernia trying to figure out what he's going to say. And when suddenly he blurts out, As soon as he says these two words, he rushes back to his microphone-clutching, closed-eyed refuge. And now I know he's losing the battle with his tears. But he wants to get the entire sentence out. "I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me." And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. "Why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you." And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And Mario, all he could do was hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. But let there be no doubt that everybody standing and clapping had been returned to themselves. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. So we will go from here, and we will imagine a circle of compassion, and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle. We will go from here, we will cling to the marrow of the gospel. Or as Pope Leo said in his recent letter, go back and reread the gospel. And we will go from here, and we will take seriously what Jesus took seriously. Inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, compassionate acceptance. And my sense of every single one of you already is that you gave up a long time ago, caring if anyone might accuse you of wasting your time at the margins. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you very much.
Father Greg, on behalf of everyone who is here this evening, thank you. We deeply appreciate your leadership. I'd ask you now, please, to take out your programs, okay, if you've got those with you. Father Greg and Homeboy Industries relies on our support. Below Father Greg's picture, you'll notice a QR code. This year end, as you're planning your giving, please remember the evening here with Father Greg. And remember Homeboy Industries in your giving. On behalf of Homeboy and all those they serve, thank you in advance for your kind support. I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that I'm a member of the Ignatian Volunteer Corps, a community of retired men and women serving those in most need in our community. If you are approaching retirement and wondering what your next chapter is, or if you're in retirement and looking for something more, or if you're part of a nonprofit seeking good, experienced support in reaching your mission, please consider checking out the Ignatian Volunteer Corps. On the inside cover of your program tonight is additional information and the website address. Thank you again for your support of this evening, for being here with us. May your travels home this evening be safe and fulfilled. Have a great evening.